Post 352. Study Session 4. Politics of Brazil. Introduction. Brazilian State-making. Our emphasis will be on how, from very early in the country's history, the building of state organization weakened democratic institutions, political representation, and the organization of civil society. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study session, you should be able to highlight how the building of state organization weakened democratic institutions in Brazil using historical approach. Analyze how economic development failed to distribute the benefits of industrialization to the masses. And lastly, describe the role of foreign policy making process in Brazil. Historical background of the Brazilian states. In October 1992, Brazil's President Fernando Collor was impeached. Just 3 years earlier, his victory has symbolized a fresh start in Brazil's quest for democracy and social equality in the country. The reinstatement of civilian rule in 1985, after 21 years of a repressive military regime, had appeared to create favorable political conditions for solving Brazil's grave social problems. A new constitution was enacted in 1988, guaranteeing direct elections at all levels and confirming the principle of separation between executive, judicial, and legislative powers. Political and civil rights were restored, and broad spectrums of parties, including those on the left, were given legal status. Collor's inauguration as the first president elected by universal suffrage since 1964 seemed finally to confirm the long-awaited return to democracy. Unfortunately, subsequent events raised questions about whether Brazil's restoration of democracy would prove durable. Long-standing problems and their effects in the post-1985 period are highlighted by Collor's rise and fall. Rising from political obscurity, Collor fought a grueling campaign against his rival, the left-wing Labour leader and the head of the Workers' Party, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Business elites opposed to the Workers' Party gave Collor their support. They viewed him as their best bet to reduce Brazil's large public sector and promote the private sector according to free market principles. Collor's campaign strategy was to depict himself as the only leader capable of overcoming the corruption and inefficiency of Brazilian politics. His goal was to appeal to the millions of Brazilians frustrated with the country's economy and the inertia of federal and state bureaucracies. Though born to a wealthy and politically powerful family from a poor state in the northeast, Collor was presented to voters as a voice against corruption and old politics. Labeled by the media as the hunter of Maharajas, the highly paid political appointees who benefited greatly from bureaucratic corruption, Collor surpassed his competitors for the presidency within the first months of campaigning. The candidate's rhetoric was welcomed by the descamisados, literally the shirtless, poor who were attracted by his attacks against politicians and the social problems caused by bureaucratic inefficiency. Collor took on the image of a Don Quixote battling everything and everybody, from greedy entrepreneurs who receive special protection and subsidies from their political friends, to corrupt politicians who practice graft on any everyday business or run powerful political machines at the state level. As a skillful performer on television, Collor mobilized the people's frustration and resentment, at once symbolizing opposition to the state's politics and politicians. Collor's victory, however, did not extend to members of his practically unknown party, the National Renovation Party, who failed to win election to Congress. Lacking the support of a partisan majority and facing severe opposition from his many political rivals in the legislature, Collor implemented policy through a number of top-down emergency methods. His favorite instruments were executive decrees and provisional acts, which bypassed most forms of congressional oversight. Often, color justified these measures by going directly to the public via the mass media. By gathering popular support outside the legislature, Collor believed that he could effectively railroad his policies through Congress. The centerpiece of Collor's economic policies was an anti-inflationary provision in 1990, which froze most of the country's financial assets. This measure severely penalized the upper and middle classes, many of whom could not protect their savings from the freeze. To the descamisados, such a policy meant long-awaited justice and vengeance against the elites. However, Collor's failure to achieve inflation control, state reform, and social reform precipitated his fall. By the end of 1990, Collor's popularity was rapidly declining. He tried to renew his image as a resolute savior of the country by acting audaciously on a number of public occasions, but he was never able to reclaim the degree of popular support he enjoyed immediately following his election. High levels of continuing poverty and corruption made Collor's image as a warrior against injustice and crime an object of public mockery. Ironically, the mobilization of public opinion against corruption, triggered by his own electoral campaign, eventually turned against him. Shortly after evidence emerged in 1992 that the president and a number of his closest relatives and friends were involved in the embezzlement of public funds and other corrupt acts, a public campaign to oust Collor was launched. By the end of 1992, mass demonstrations had succeeded in pressing the legislature to impeach the president. Collor's story revealed much about the obstacles facing the consolidation of democracy in Brazil. As in recent India and Russian history, social inequalities, weak political parties, the abuse of executive powers, inflation, and a general incapacity for policy making have lowered the prospects for democracy in Brazil. Above all, Collor's presidency illustrates the political elite's incapacity or lack of will to deal with the miserable socioeconomic conditions of large segments of Brazilian population. Brazil's political history demonstrates that democracy must be based on a host of political and social institutions, and not simply on periodic elections. Since 1891, the country has had many institutional features of a modern democracy. However, it has been democratic mostly in name because important conditions which promote a durable democracy, a substantial measure of social equality and justice, have not existed. States must be capable of implementing economic and political reforms for democratic elites to be truly responsive to their constituencies. The subjugation of state organization to private network of interest in Brazil, as in Russia, Mexico, and Nigeria, have weakened the state's capacity to engage in reform. As a result, the interests of weaker social actors, the poor in particular, are not addressed. Assumptions that industrialization would, by itself, minimize inequality were and still are widespread in the world. Since the 1930s, these assumptions strongly inspired Brazilian decision makers. The military governments were champions of this view. Waving the banner of Great Brazil, they advocated the principle of attaining economic growth at all costs as a sufficient condition for future social equality. Brazil's appalling levels of poverty and inequality vividly challenge such assumptions. Sadly, the country is a world showcase of how, in the absence of a responsive democracy, the benefits of stunning economic development, industrialization, and modern production methods can be badly distributed. The nation's poor democratic development has not destroyed Brazilians' hopes. The 1994 election of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, a political figure known for his honesty, sensibility to social problems, and support for democratic principles, has partially renewed the optimism which has been shattered by Collor's fiasco. Moreover, the rise of new social movements in the country has reinforced the hopes of improving both political and social conditions. Brazil is an immigrant country of a varied ethnic makeup. In this sense, Brazil is like many of the ethnically plural societies such as India, Mexico, Nigeria, Russia, and Iran. Unlike India, Iran, and Nigeria, however, Brazilians are not greatly divided over religious differences. Catholicism was imposed by Portuguese colonial rule in Brazil and then reinforced by immigration from Catholic Italy, Spain, and Portugal after the end of colonial rule in the 19th and 20th centuries. Some African-based religions, beliefs, and rituals first brought to Brazil by slaves also coexist with Catholic observance. Centuries of voluntary and involuntary immigration of Europeans and Africans contributed to the emergence of an ethnically mixed society. Mixtures of Europeans, Africans, and Indians produce hundreds of distinct colors of people. Different cultural influences also enter this ethnic melange. European values and rituals were likewise mixed with African and Indian traditions and images. The offshoots of these cultural interrelations took on distinct regional identities over time. It should be noted that Brazil has a single dominant religious influence but is ethnically heterogeneous. The country enjoys a highly diversified economy after 4 or 5 decades of an industrial development policy aimed at achieving economic self-sufficiency. The country now produces and exports a highly diversified range of industrial goods from shoes and textiles to small aircrafts. Brazilian contractors have become successful competitors for international engineering and construction jobs, especially in the developing countries of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Because of its size, population and natural resources, and sustained economic growth, Brazil could potentially be a substantial force in international politics. With its large internal market for foreign and domestic industry, its dominance over a majority of the rainforest contained within the Amazon, the so-called green lung of the planet, Brazil possesses resources that could make it a global superpower. Unfortunately, Brazil is also impressive for many negative reasons. Although it is one of the world's 10 wealthiest economies with an industrial production base worth of $410 billion. Social indicators such as income distribution, infant mortality, and nutrition shows that it ranks near the bottom in the world of states. A profound dualism, both regional and social, characterizes Brazilian society. Unemployment and underemployment, poverty, malnutrition, and disease contrasts with the ostentation and arrogance of the wealthy few. Income disparities also generally mirror racial differences, as the poor are represented by mostly blacks and mulattoes, as offspring of racially mixed marriages are called in Brazil, whereas the rich are invariably mostly white. The poverty of the north and northeast also contrasts with the more industrialized and prosperous southeastern and southern states. The country's perverse socioeconomic inequality is a direct consequence of its historic choice of economic development strategies and of its shallow experiences with democracy. For most of its almost 2 centuries as an independent country, Brazil has enjoyed many aspects of a liberal democracy. Since the country became independent from Portugal in 1822, the Brazilian elite has usually espoused liberal ideas inspired by the French Revolution and the United States Constitution, separation of powers between executive, legislative, and judiciary, freedom of speech, and the right to vote. These ideas were expressed in most of the Brazilian constitutions enacted during the 19th and the 20th centuries. Nevertheless, such liberal ideas were not often synonymous with true democracy in Brazil. Equality of opportunity and citizenship did not historically include the majority of Brazilians. As we shall explain later, the integration of the popular sectors was established through institutions considered inimical to democracy, state corporatism and populism. The Brazilian experience with such institutions throughout much of the 20th century became a basis for the establishment in 1964 of military authoritarianism. The circumstances involved in the transition from a military regime and the institutional legacies inherited from Brazil's past made clear that the way to a true democracy would be more difficult than initially envisaged. Considering the many challenges facing Brazil, it would be an understatement to say that the country is at the crossroads. The political turbulence and despair induced by the fiasco of Collor's presidency made unmistakably clear to all Brazilians that perhaps now more than ever change is essential. To understand the problems that have afflicted Brazil and still persist till this day, we now turn to a historical analysis of the most important points, the critical junctures of Brazilian politics that have helped to determine the development of the modern state and democracy. Emergence of central bureaucratic power. Brazil was discovered in 1500 by Pedro Álvares Cabral. Unlike the other countries of Latin America, Brazil was a Portuguese colony, not a Spanish one. Thus, it was spared the devastatingly violent wars of independence that afflicted its neighbors. Instead, Brazil gained its independence peacefully in 1822, when Dom Pedro I, the son of the Portuguese king, Dom João VI, declared himself Emperor of Brazil, with the support of Brazilians and Portuguese residents in the country. Dom Pedro I was succeeded by his son, Dom Pedro II, who reigned as emperor from 1840 to 1889. The sole hereditary constitutional monarchy in Latin America, the Brazilian Empire, remained in power for 67 years. Brazil's post-independence state building was driven primarily by the need to maintain both territorial integration and the slave labor on which its export-based economy depended. From a very clear point in Brazilian history, national political power was centralized. Although a modern bureaucratic state had yet to be formed, the early experience of the empire had a tremendous influence on the character of subsequent state formation. The 1824 Constitution conferred specific reserve powers on the monarchy that continued to the empire's end. These powers transformed the monarchy into moderating power, destined to stand above and harmonize the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government, to arbitrate party conflicts, and to fulfill the responsibilities of government when non-royal agents failed. The emperor had the authority to appoint ministers and dismiss legislative assemblies. The early centralization of authority was a key factor differentiating the Brazilian experience from that of other post-colonial Latin American states. Whereas the former Spanish colonies suffered from conflicts among many provisional, territorial, dispersed strongmen called caudillos, Brazilian state building overcame the challenges of governing a large territory with economically and socially diverse regions. On the eve of independence in 1822, Brazil was already becoming economically diverse. The sugar company of the northeastern region, dominant in the 18th century, was a mere shadow of what it had once been. Its slaves and freed population, however, continued to have an important socio-economic impact on the northeast and other regions. The migration and sale of labor from the declining sugar region to the central south region and the ranch economy of the southern region expanded the labor pool southwards. The existence of a national slave economy had direct effects on the centralization of national power. In 1819, there were 1.1 million slaves, which corresponded to 30% of the population. In 1872, there were 1.5 million slaves, which represented 15.2% of the population. British pressure during mid-century to end the international slave trade led the Brazilian imperial state to take a strong international position in favor of slavery. A combination of the continued reliance on slave labor and the perceived need to rebuff British interventionism in imperial policy compelled the empire to oppose external pressures. However, the regional oligarchy was far too fragmented politically and geographically to represent a unified front to Britain's influence. Thus, they relied on the central government to confront international opposition to slave economy. These events marked a pivotal movement in Brazilian state development. The central government reaffirmed its authority over a fragmented rural oligarchy by standing up to an external power of considerable military capabilities. By the mid-19th century, the empire had built a state and firmly established its territorial unity despite many obstacles: inadequate means of communication and transportation, the fragmentation of the national economy into regional economies, and the absence of a strong sense of national identity. Over the course of the century, the centralizing authority of the Poder Moderador and the development of a bureaucratic structure made the Brazilian imperial state, along with the Chilean state, one of the two most institutionally developed states on the continent. The early pattern of imperial state formation was marked by several key strengths and weaknesses. Both the relative territorial unity achieved under the empire and an executive with command over the formal mechanisms of government were among the strengths. Among the weaknesses, a crucial one was the early formation of an administrative bureaucracy long before most Brazilians could participate in politics, with the effect that the provincial elites who had access to positions of power within the bureaucracy would come to dominate Brazilian politics. Because Brazil's export-based economy produced cycles of economic growth and recession, upper-class unemployment was common. An expanding bureaucracy created jobs for members of the higher social strata. In the 19th century, the general underdevelopment of the country, the crisis in the northeast sugar economy, and the monopoly of trade by foreigners in the largest municipalities led many members of the land-owning class to take positions in the bureaucracy. The expansion of citizenship and the political participation of other segments of Brazilian society would make other groups more significant much later. But from a very early time in the history of Brazilian state building, provincial elites, who often represented powerful economic interests, dominated national bureaucracy. The constitutional empire marked the birth of Brazilian liberal institutions. In stark contrast with its neighbors, the country enjoyed several features of a functioning representative democracy: regularity of elections, the alternation of parties in power, and scrupulous observation of the constitution. In substance, however, liberal institutions only regulated political competition among the rural oligarchical elites, reflecting the interests of a privileged minority and not the larger Brazilian population. The social reality of the country was an agrarian and illiterate slave society governed by cosmopolitan elites that mimicked European civilization. Liberal Republican order. The next critical juncture in Brazilian history occurred in 1889 with the peaceful demise of the empire and the emergence of an oligarchical republic commanded by land-owning elites from Brazil's coffee regions. Many causes led to the end of the empire. The institutions of slavery and the monarchy were topics of heated debate among landowners, politicians, and commercial elites. In the mid-19th century, worldwide abolitionist movement brought pressure upon the Brazilian monarchy to end slavery. These pressures resulted in governmental measures which freed slaves over 60 years of age and children of slaves not yet born. Full abolition occurred only when it became clear to the powerful coffee elite of the state of São Paulo that the institution could not provide them with enough cheap labor. By 1888, all slaves were formally freed from bondage. Among the expanding bureaucratic, commercial, and professional middle classes, Republican ideas circulated widely during the last decade of the empire, creating a growing receptivity for alternative forms of government. The land-owning oligarchy, mainly from the coffee regions, advocated more decentralized government, with more influence over policy making. Liberalism was considered consistent with these interests because it was opposed to the despotic rule of a centralized government. Many political institutions from the monarchy were replaced by new institutions after the end of the empire in 1889. The liberal Brazilian Constitution of 1891, which was closely inspired by the US constitutional model, established a directly elected president as the head of the government, separated the state from the Catholic Church, and expanded the franchise to include all literal males. The legitimacy of the republican political system was thus formally established on the principle of equal political rights for everyone, rather than, as previously, on the hereditary rights of the emperor. The states were granted autonomy, extensive fiscal rights, and the right to contract foreign laws without the federal government's endorsement. They also had the authority to levy export taxes on products destined for other states and maintain militias stronger than the local contingents of the federal army. Although the Republican elite went further than the empire's elite in expressing liberal ideas in the constitution, to the majority of Brazilians, Republican liberalism was a sham. Brazil continued to be a predominantly rural society. In 1890, only 6 cities had more than 50,000 inhabitants out of a population of 14 million. The landed oligarchy vigorously suppressed dissent in the rural areas, and labor associations and urban interests were excluded from any meaningful participation. The patron clans, ties that continued to keep poor people from mobilizing politically, were widespread. The abolition of slavery did not significantly change the position of free slaves in Brazilian society. The old republic proved to be a watershed for the evolution of state formation and Brazilian politics into the next century. The states were granted autonomy, extensive fiscal rights, and the right to contract foreign laws without the federal government's endorsement. They also had the authority to levy export taxes on products destined for other states and maintain militias stronger than the local contingents of the federal army. Although the Republican elite went further than the empire's elite in expressing liberal ideas in the constitution, to the majority of Brazilians, Republican liberalism was a sham. Brazil continued to be a predominantly rural society. In 1890, only 6 cities had more than 50,000 inhabitants out of a population of 14 million. The landed oligarchy vigorously suppressed dissent in the rural areas, and labor associations and urban interests were excluded from any meaningful participation. The patron clan ties that continued to keep poor people from mobilizing politically were widespread. The abolition of slavery did not significantly change the position of free slaves in Brazilian society. The old republic proved to be a watershed for the evolution of state formation and Brazilian politics into the next century. First, it institutionalized the process known as Coronalismo, the national governing grants of extensive extralegal authority to local rural bosses in exchange for electoral support. Second, the old republic established within the central state the power of governors. The local colonels, who exercised political control in villages and countries, came to depend exclusively on the regional governors, who became the chief controllers of the electoral process and local politicians. Even today, governors continue to play a key role in national agenda setting, and they virtually dominate party politics. The regional governors continue to be at the center of federal and regional patrimonialism. The centralized posts of political power still weaken the National Congress as a center of party development and policy making. A third, but no less important, development during the old republic was the emergence of the national military as a key actor in Brazilian politics. After the military revolt that precipitated the fall of the monarchy, the military underwent a process of continued professionalism and modernization. The upsurge in European immigration, the beginnings of industrialization, and the modernization of national military proved essential for the expansion of the middle class, composed of artisans, professionals, politicians, civil servants, and military officers. With increased urbanization, these groups tended to weaken the political monopoly of the rural oligarchy and its clientele list order, increased demands for expanded suffrage, urban political power, and the frustrations of young military officers culminated in another critical moment of Brazilian political history: the 1930 Revolution. A series of military revolts in 1922 and 1924, led by junior officers, the tenentes, convinced the upper classes that the institutions of the old republic could not hold together much longer. Workers' demonstrations and the rise of the Brazilian Communist Party suggested that the end of the old republic was at hand. From the ranks of discontented political elites, a figure emerged who would change the shape of Brazilian politics for the rest of the century: Getúlio Vargas. The events around the presidential campaign and the effects of the 1929 crisis led to the 1930s revolution that brought Vargas to power. Previously, social rights issues were treated by political elites as a mere security issue, in which the police were considered more effective for securing social peace than for ensuring social rights. However, during the 1930s, the government began developing policies to treat social rights concerns as more than security issues. This acknowledgement took on particular characteristics, such as the abandonment of the liberal ideas that had guided the previous regimes. For the elites in power during Vargas' regime, the masses were considered, but their demands were met by voluntary concessions from a paternalistic state. People were to participate not via party membership, elections, or representation in Congress, but through state-created and state-regulated unions or associations. Moreover, only members of these state-sponsored unions and associations could enjoy the new social rights. These values and structures formed the body of what has been called state corporatism. Corporatism refers to a method of organizing public-private relations and participation. It rejects the idea of competition among social groups by having the state deliberately organize political activity and settle conflicts. In state corporatism, the state dominates both labor and businesses, turning unions and associations into little more than vehicles for transmitting orders from extensive powers. In Brazil, this concept was inspired by the Iberian and Eastern European corporatist Catholic rites during the 1920s and the 1930s. The components of the Vargas paradigm were an irreversible increase in central authority, along with a high degree of state intervention in the economy for the purpose of promoting industrialization. 2. The creation of symbols of national identity, with the adoption of a cultural policy based on both nationalism and the charisma of the presidential office. 3. Implementation of welfare policies and concession of workers' rights intended to draw the growing urban working class into a network of state-controlled labor unions. 4. A low level of legitimacy for political parties and for Congress, who were depicted as beholden to oligarchical interests. The first and second elements reinforce each other in a clear manner. The symbolism of new states conferred the image of the national states as the protector of all Brazilians. Vargas was called the father of the people. The new regime expanded a few rudimentary social insurance and pension programs into a broad welfare and health care system for urban workers. Although unemployment insurance was not emphasized by the new laws, workers were provided with insurance against occupational accidents, illness, and death. A Ministry of Labor was created, and labor courts were instituted to regulate and solve conflicts between employers and labor. The state also expanded its interventionist role in the area of welfare through state agencies created to handle subsidized housing, food, and education for specific sectors of the urban working population. These policies increased the dependency of workers and even the middle class on federal subsidies and the provision of public sector jobs. The cooperative structure of interest mediation and representation reinforced the idea, central to the new state, that the federal government was the key mobilizer, provider, and protector of the Brazilian nation. One important element of these national projects was the close identification of the worker with citizenship, based on what was called the worker status. The Brazilian state gave social and political identity to the common man. The statutes claimed that workers who were members of official unions were guaranteed full Brazilian citizenship. As a complement to the state-centered and state cooperative character of the new state, element proved pivotal. Vargas' position as a father of the people could not be questioned by competing political images and organizations. Parties and congressional politicians became mere outsiders. Vargas coined a phrase that best expressed the illegitimacy of representative bodies. From now on, there are to be no middlemen between the president and the people. One of the key thinkers of the new state coined another, even more dramatic phrase: the new regime can have only one party, namely that of the state, which is at the same time the party of the nation. The particular legacy of state centralism in Brazil contrasted significantly with what happened in other Latin American countries. Brazil was not the only country in South America to have adopted corporatism. Chile took this path in the 1920s, Mexico in the 1930s, and Argentina in the 1940s. Brazil's political development evolved in clear contrast to the Mexican experience, whereas Mexican Revolution of 1910 turned rural workers into political actors. In Brazil, these social segments remained politically marginal, non-citizens, up to the late 1950s. More importantly, the Mexican state incorporated segments of rural poor and the urban working class into a party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. After 1929, Brazil presented nothing similar, merely a patchwork of local oligarchical organizations that had been parties only in name during the old republic. The growth of a powerful and centralized bureaucracy before party and suffrage development weakened the role of party system that was eventually created after World War II. When national parties finally emerged, they were powerless to modify the vision of the state as a private inherited property, owned both by the bureaucracy and by the landed powers. In short, a patrimonial state. Furthermore, the parties soon realized that their chances for survival as organizations rested on the privileged access to benefits granted by the bureaucracy. Electoral and party politics became secondary institutions in the decision-making process. The military was another important focus of Vargas' reforms. Under the new state, the armed forces experienced massive improvements in armament production and recruitment. Professional standards of promotion, conduct, and the use of force were codified in the establishment of the Superior War College, Escola Superior de Guerra. The military had been an important political actor since the proclamation of the Republic, but it was during the new state that the military established itself as a policy maker and developed new doctrines for inspiring the crucial role the military should play in Brazilian politics. The military's linkage of industrialization and national security was a hallmark of these doctrinal changes. The ideology of the military regimes that dominated Brazil from 1964 to 1985 emerged directly from these earlier experiences. Organization of the states. Brazil's constitutional rules have undergone many rapid changes over the last 45 years. Judged by the standard of 2 decades of authoritarianism, the 1988 Constitution presents some impressive changes. Still, core institutions and practices inherited from the past have been grafted onto contemporary organizations of the state. Important limitations to democracy in Brazil remain the long-standing preeminence of the executive powers, military prerogatives over policy making, retention of bureaucratic discretion in policy formulation, state monopolies in several sectors, and corporates union representation. The 1987 Constituent Assembly that drafted the 1988 Constitution re-examined the Vargas institutional legacy as a whole. The debates among the delegates highlighted a new and crucial development in Brazilian politics, the erosion of elite consensus concerning the viability of older institutions inspired by Vargas' paradigm. At the same time, no clear alternative to old institutions emerged. The drafting of the new constitution might have been an opportunity for redressing some of Brazil's many institutional problems. Instead, it became an arena of confusion and uncertainty about which institutions should accompany democracy. Debates and political conflicts also swelled around the 1988 constitution's many controversial provisions concerning presidentialism, division of resources and obligations between the Union and the states, privatization, and the increase in the number of social rights. The 1988 Constitution was simultaneously the focus of much hope and the object of intense attack. As such, it became too diffuse and too mired in politics to provide a coherent vision of precisely how the country's political institutions should be structured and what functions they should serve. The relative incoherence of the 1988 Constitution means that power, notably the separation of powers, is less important than ad hoc arrangements in determining power relations among the branches of government and between the federal and state governments. Informal relations and understandings still play a major role in the interpretation of law and authority. Certain generalizations, however, about the organization of the Brazilian state can be made. First, the church and state are officially separated. The Catholic Church has never controlled any portion of the state apparatus or maintained a direct influence on national politics to the extent that it did in other Catholic countries such as Spain. This does not mean, however, that the Catholic Church plays no role in Brazilian politics, as we will see in the next session. Secondly, Brazil has a presidential system of government in which the directly elected president is the head of state, the head of government, and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The Brazilian state was organized to assure vast power in the hands of the executive. In theory, it comprised the balance of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, but traditionally, Brazilian presidents have been freer of judicial and legislative constraints than their European or North American counterparts. Not only have past Brazilian constitutions granted the executive more discretion in enforcing laws or in making policy, but in actual practice, presidents have exercised more authority than the other branches of government. The legislature and the judiciary historically have played secondary functions. The organization of the Brazilian state defies the checks and balances that works relatively well in the United States presidential system. It differs also from the semi-presidentialism of France, in which the directly elected president, although dominant over the legislature and judiciary, faces broader constraints to the abuse of executive power, both constitutional and de facto, than the Brazilian president. The French parliament has a stronger presence in the pattern of executive-legislative relations, although its prime minister is appointed by the executive and not elected by the legislature. As in other parliamentary systems, he or she is chosen from the party with the majority of elected representatives in parliament, which is not necessarily the president's party. Moreover, the French party system is more organized and less fragmented than its counterparts in Brazil, making the legislature more efficient and capable of checking executive actions. The presidency remains very powerful. The executive and the bureaucracy contain most of the policy-making and implementation functions. Both the federal legislature and the state governments look to the presidency, and in economic matters to the Minister of the Economy for leadership on policy. At times, the Ministers of the Economy, of Planning, and the President of the Central Bank retain more discretion over the details of policy than the President. This is a function of both of the different styles and expertise of the presidents and of the needs of the movement. Inflationary crises have often forced a shifting of discretionary power over price controls and interest rates to the ministers of the economic bureaucracy, that is, the Minister of the Economy, Industry and Planning. The Minister of Justice has recently retained sweeping powers over tax reform and the judiciary. Third, various institutions in Brazilian history have constrained the power of the executive. In the wake of transition to democratic rule in 1985, these institutions have become critical to democracy. The 1988 Constitution have many oversight functions to the legislature and judiciary, so that presidential discretion in economic and social policy is now largely subject to approval by either the legislature or the judiciary or both. This gives them some independence and leverage over the presidency, although often they are not employed effectively. Creating democratic institutions and maintaining them are not similar processes. Traditions carry weight, and the obstacles to the decentralization of executive power are still enormous. The powers and the resources still held by the president, combined with the expansion of the powers of the legislature, and resulted in the current form of government, which many authors label quasi-presidentialist or quasi-parliamentary, depending on their point of view. At the core of this term is the concept that the authority of each main branch of government, the legislature and the executive, overlaps so that neither branch clearly understands its role and power. Despite the fact that some political scientists have argued that mixtures of presidentialism and parliamentarism are best for the survival of democratic institutions and economic policy effectiveness, Brazil's uncertain mixture of these forms leaves much room for doubt. Conflict between the presidency and Congress over competencies have politicized and complicated the everyday flow of legislature. It is too early to say if any issue on the nation's political agenda was solved by the 1988 Constitution. The most disputed decision made by the Constituent Assembly can be changed. In fact, the constitutional text as a whole was open to revision in 1995, when disputes and senators decided by a majority of 60% which changes should be engineered. Constitutional revision is a continuing debate in Congress, although certain issues remain untouchable. The federal structure, secret and direct vote, the formal separation of power, and individual rights. Despite divergent evaluations of the Constitution, clearly it has already promoted important incentives to transform the redistribution of power at several levels and branches of the government. The Executive. The delegates of the 1987 Constituent Assembly opted to preserve the presidential system of government. The continuation of presidentialism in 1988 was assured by an odd coalition that included the extreme left, heads of Vargas populism, various business sectors, and the military. Support for the presidential system was based mainly on the view that decision-making functions should be centralized in the chief of state. For many Brazilians, governmental effectiveness has historically been identified with presidential supremacy. Also, for a large number of politicians, the presidential office became the ultimate distributor of clientelism, credits, public investments, and the arbiter among regional interests. For the popular sector, it has been the focus of demand for improvements in living conditions and better wages. For the military, the president is the very embodiment of national security. The 1988 Constitution granted citizens the right to vote by plebiscite on the system of government. In reality, the issue was not resolved in 1988, but deferred for a plebiscite held in 1993, which reaffirmed the presidential system, thus eliminating parliamentarism. The issue continued to cut across all parties, from the left to the right. The preference for presidentialism over parliamentarism was based on two major factors: widespread suspicion of legislative politics and the belief made popular by campaigns to retain presidentialism that the parliamentary option was little more than a trick to take the right to vote away from the people. The concept of parliamentary system that would allow a prime minister to be elected by legislative elites and not directly by the citizenry seemed contrary to what Brazilians had fought for during the long struggle for democracy. The ultimate check upon the presidency, direct elections by voters every 4 years, is retained as the core institution of Brazilian democracy. Similar to the French system, should no candidate win an absolute majority of votes on the first ballot, a runoff election follows between the two leading candidates. Because one of the opposition's most important demands against authoritarian governments involved the reduction of the federal executive power, the 1988 Constitution reinstated some important checks on executive supremacy. Congressional prerogatives that had existed prior to 1964 were reinstated and new ones were granted. Oversight of economic policy and rights of consultation concerning executive appointments were among the additions to the legislative branch. Executive decrees were abolished, and in their place, provisional measures were established, which must be voted on by the Congress under certain conditions. The provisional measures are weaker instruments because, unlike executive decrees, they can be modified in Congress. In the case of macroeconomic policies, for example, a two-thirds votes of both houses may override a provisional measure. These measures, nonetheless, still provide much leeway, if not a virtual monopoly, for executive initiatives, and were abusively used by all presidents since Sarney's administration. Based on the argument that the Brazilian economy is passing through a major crisis characterized by spiraling inflation and industrial stagnation, provisional measures were enacted with the intent of hastening decision-making. Collor's anti-inflation policy dramatically illustrated the dominance of the presidency over the Congress and the judiciary. Through provisional measures, he was able to freeze the nation's financial assets as an anti-inflationary measure. Collor severely abused his power, handing down 150 provisional measures in the first year of his presidency. Technically, this meant that the country experienced a crisis situation every 48 hours. The Supreme Tribunal, the highest court in Brazil, did little to curb this obvious abuse of the constitutional authority by the president, although the effects upon the economy are debatable. The concentration of discretionary authority over economic policy making in the executive is a clear result of the frequent employment of provisional decree powers. The presidential election is a great political event because much is at stake, especially appointments to powerful executive positions and the shape of policy in key areas like economic reforms. The Brazilian president has broad powers to select and dismiss close associates. He or she selects ministers for the armed forces according to the merit system prevailing in their respective branches. Usually, the president appoints other ministers from groups of his longtime cronies and collaborators or from any of the existing parties. Until recently, appointment choices did not need to be sanctioned by any other governmental authority. Rigorous oversight and approval functions were considerably weakened because the Brazilian president could name thousands of public officials, making Brazil one of the world's most blatant examples of the power of appointment. Currently, the president must negotiate with Congress and some powerful groups over certain positions in the cabinet, mainly those responsible for economic policy making. Even so, the president currently maintains impressive powers of appointments. A certain hierarchy of influence among ministers can be identified. According to the command over resources, a certain hierarchy of influence among ministers can be identified according to the command over resources each enjoys. Since the military period, the heads of the Ministry of Economy have had more authority than other cabinet members, especially with the country's recent economic problems. The preeminence of this ministry is currently at its height. Recent ministers of economy have had levels of authority typical of a prime minister in a parliamentary system. Authority over the federal budget and economic policy enables the Minister of Economy to influence all significant foreign and domestic economic policies. As a recent indicator of the power of this cabinet position, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, a former Minister of the Economy in the Itamar Franco government, won the 1994 presidential election based largely on his claim that his anti-inflation reform had proven successful. Policy making process. The country's policy making is an embodiment of what Douglas Chalmers has called the politicized state, that is, a state in which political exchanges govern each stage of the policy making processes, formulation, decision making, and implementation. One of the main characteristics in the overall process of policy making is the divorce between the levels at which the policies are formulated and the formal channel to implement them. Two features dominate Brazilian policymaking. 1. An executive power that holds broad autonomous powers to formulate policies without following regular procedures with representative institutional bodies. And 2. The permeability of the bureaucracy to clientelist interests. Overall, the formulation of social and economic policy has consistently been made within the national and state executive branches. Foreign policy remains an object of exclusive decision by a few ministries, military representatives, and the president. Also, the bargaining arenas where the decisions regarding investment policies and overall capital accumulation takes place are only marginally open to political parties or to the Congress. It is fair to say that for most of Brazilian business, bureaucratic politics are more accessible to entrepreneurial lobbying. Brazilian business prefers not to be formally identified with any political party in the policy-making process. A complex network of informal and formal relations within the bureaucratic hierarchy dominates virtually all significant decision-making process. Consequently, the role of the Congress in the decision-making process has been historically far from crucial in Brazil. During the democratic period between 1945 and 1964, presidents and politically adept bureaucrats often struck bargains with local elites in order to establish policies. Under military rule, central ministries took a more pivotal role in the construction of political coalitions in favor of economic policy. Relations between governors and the national bureaucracy are the cornerstone of these coalitions. Since 1985, one widely discussed possibility regarding policy making was the use of neo-cooperative pacts, negotiated agreements among state officials and the leaders of labor and business peak associations. Because the new democratic regime provided for representation by businesses and labor groups in administrative agencies and regulatory bodies, there was much hope that such paths could serve to mitigate the dilemmas of policymaking by developing interactions among the principal economic actors. Shortly after, SANE took power in 1986. For example, talks were initiated between business, government, and representatives of one or two of the major labor federations. This quickly broke down. The cleavages within the Brazilian Union movement indicated that some sector of organized labor always manifested its refusal to be bound by any agreement. After the talks failed, the government launched by decree the Cruzeiro Plan. A new round of negotiations started, failed once more, and a new executive decree launched, still another economic plan a few months later. Whereas these pacts have undoubtedly been a factor contributing to successful economic management in small European countries, in most of Latin America, they have achieved virtually nothing. Conditions in most of Latin America differ sharply from the developed world. High level of income inequality, the partial functioning of market economies, the lack of strong social democratic parties, and unified labor movement. These factors greatly limit the possibility of reaching credible agreements between political forces. Bureaucracy and the states. The 1988 Constitution failed to alter significantly the concentration of power in the federal bureaucracy, especially in the economic bureaucracy, although it was hoped that the Constitution would give incentives to expand private initiative or to set only general guidelines for the operation of the economy. The main instruments of economic regulation created during the military period and concentrated in the federal bureaucracy were retained. The 1988 Constitution actually codified bureaucratic monopolies over policy formulation and monopolies by state firms in basic economic sectors such as oil, gas, production and refining, the exploration of minerals, nuclear energy, and telecommunications. Although these agencies are still in place, the 1988 Constitution did include mechanisms to limit their proliferation and fiscal independence. The authority of bureaucratic agencies to incur debt was severely curtailed. Most important, the 1988 Constitution forbids the executive from creating new state agencies or corporations without Congress approval. Since 1940, the government has created a huge number of bureaucratic agencies, independent of the central ministries, in order to free the latter from undue political manipulation and to increase their effectiveness for the implementation of various developmental projects. Some of these agencies have been granted fiscal autonomy and have accumulated most of the current public debt. The economic weight of the public sector in the overall economy has grown progressively since the new states. An annual ranking of Brazil's largest 500 corporations in 1981 revealed that 10 of the top 25 firms were owned by the federal government and 8 belonged to state governments. The sectors dominated by these public firms include aluminium, petroleum, chemical, electrical power, iron mining, and finance. Public expenditures as a share of GDP increased from 16% to 27% from 1947 to 1967. By 1969, this percentage exceeded 32% of GDP, a far higher rate than any other Latin American country, with the exception of socialist Cuba. In the 1950s, the main developmental projects were hydroelectric plants and the building of Brasilia. State firms like Petrobras and Usiminas, having dominated Brazil's development and account for much of the country's export and industrial production. Petrobras, for example, continues to be one of the largest corporations in the world, and Vale do Rio Doce, a mining and metallurgy operation, continues to figure prominently in Brazil's export statistics. Under the 3 last military presidents, numerous projects were developed: the Trans-Amazonian Highway, the Northeast Petrochemical Industrial District, the largest hydroelectric plant in the world, railroads, the Tokurov hydroelectric plants, the SO Minas Metallurgy Park, and the National Nuclear Reactor Program, to name just a few. Before the debt crisis in 1983, a private research organization called IBASE identified 33 huge state projects, some already in operation, that will absorb $88 billion in external debts, would employ 1.5 million people, and would add $47 billion to annual production. The external debt crisis caused some of these projects to be abandoned. Others, however, continue to be developed. The National Bank for Economic and Social Development, founded by Vargas in the early 1950s, played a key role in channeling public funds to industrial projects. Among many projects, the BNDES financed the expansion of automobile production during the 1950s, public works in mining and metallurgy during the 1970s, and is still the center of a debate on the role of public financing and industrial policy in Brazil. Nonetheless, the Brazilian bureaucracy also has a technocrat and professional side. The technocrat tendency was especially evident in state agencies that retained autonomy from powerful capitalist interests and placed much emphasis on efficiency. These agencies were often considered islands of efficiency in a state apparatus characterized by organizations riddled with patronage. The BNDES, the National Development Bank, was the archetypal case. Its professional hiring and advancement practices, its logical hierarchical structure, and its code of civil service made it an efficient and remarkable resourceful targeter of public sector finance to industry. The capacity of state agencies to set priorities for stabilization and growth in the 1980s and 1990s has been seriously hindered by the old politics of clientelism and the mercurial politics of Brazil's civilian presidents. The current emphasis on cutting the wages of public employees has bled the bureaucracy of its most talented personnel. Cuts in retraining and education have diluted the technocratic and professional strains within the state bureaucracy by reducing the recruitment pool. Once again, patronage has become a mechanism for advancement and protecting one's own job. Professionals who had never concerned themselves with politics are increasingly cultivating political ties in order to keep their jobs. The recent privatization of Usiminas by the Collor administration and the promise of the new Cardoso administration to privatize Vale do Rio Doce clearly marked the end of development via state firms in Brazil. Due to growing fiscal burdens and macroeconomic problems, political pressure has intensified from the IMF and domestic business to downsize state agencies and semi-public firms and sell off their assets at public auctions. This is partly because they no longer offer the rich patronage they once did. Fiscal cutbacks have left many agencies a mere shadow of what they were in the 1960s and 1970s. Nevertheless, the public firms continue to be significant economic actors in Brazil. Military and politics. The military is another significant and powerful arm of the state. Like many other Latin American militaries, the Brazilian armed forces still retain a substantial degree of independence from civilian presidents and legislatures. This is in contrast to the Mexican situation, where the military has for most of the 20th century been subordinated to command by the presidency. Mexico has suffered no coups or even serious threats of coups, as has been the case in Brazilian politics. In addition, the Mexican military has not acted as a powerful interest group, blocking policies it does not like and dictating those it favors, as has been true in Brazil. Military participation in Brazilian politics changed from near dominance during the authoritarian period to a more limited role in support of the civilian regimes. Some qualifications, however, should be emphasized. As in previous constitutions enacted after World War II, the recent transition to democracy also granted the armed forces a broad mandate to guarantee internal order. This principle allows the military to play a tutelary role. Democracy and civilian government exist only at the sufferance of the military. Civilians fear that any action which might be seen as a threat to the military may induce a coup. During the 1988 constitutional review, the military ministers, the official representatives on constitutional commissions, and the military lobbies launched an extensive campaign to neutralize their opponents and win allies to retain the traditional constitutional role for the military in domestic affairs. In 1987 and 1988, the ideological climate and civil-military relations were such that more than half of the members of the assembly said they were in favor of some internal defense role for the military. As a result, the military had a significant impact in some of the most important decisions made by the Constitutional Assembly. Their interference was crucial in securing votes against parliamentarism, land reforms, and changes in corporatist representation. One of the key indicators of the military's continued freedom from civilian control is that although not prescribed by the Constitution, the Minister of Defense remains a military position, not a civilian one. Although precise figures are lacking, many middle and lower level positions of bureaucratic agencies are occupied by members of the armed forces in practically all agencies of the federal government. Policy implementation. Debate and lobbying do not stop in Brazil once laws are enacted. Policy implementation is a subject of perpetual bargaining. In this sense, there's always the Brazilian way around the law. Politics and patronage have played the central role in getting things done in Brazil. The trading of local support for national resources, the essence of what Americans call the pork barrel politics, has been perfected in Brazil during decades of practice. An essential element of pork barrel politics in Brazil is the permeability of the structure of the federal bureaucracy, which is highly fragmented and colonized by elite interests. State bureaucrats are often linked with politicians and capitalists in an institutionalized form. Some scholars call it bureaucratic rings. Some sets of individuals, bureaucrats, connected with small sets of individual industrialists, usually through some pivotal office holders. These rings are ardent defenders of their own interest because they are entrenched and well connected throughout the Brazilian bureaucracy. Few policies can be implemented without the resources and political support of the most powerful bureaucratic rings. Organized private interests have more often than not opposed executive policies or sought to turn these policies to collective or individual advantage. One prominent example is the influence of the Federation of Sao Paulo Industries. Few major economic policies are passed without changes from the lobbying efforts to the FIESP. Only recently have such interests begun to coordinate their demands in the form of public demonstrations and statements or unified lobbying strategies. As a result of the huge expansion of the state apparatus and of the clientelism within it, the private sector has captured many state units. Various bureaucratic agencies and politicians in the executive and legislative are interested in the maintenance of such dynamics only for the benefits and profits resulting from it. Politicians, both central and regional state elites, function as brokers between the bureaucracy and private interest, and the opportunities for illegal enrichment through bribes and graft help to maintain the system. Politicians are driven to buy political support, which becomes increasingly more expensive through the manipulation of public policies that benefit the groups they serve. Since decisions about the most important policies still remain a monopoly of the bureaucracy, the majority of legislatures do not feel responsible for the course of public policies. Each action, each project, each measure to be implemented is preceded by numerous bargains with political leaders. Such pork barreling grossly distorts the intent and substance of what was originally intended by legislatures. Another aspect related to the implementation of public policies is the lack of information that policymakers have about how citizens will react to state policies. The inputs of policymaking are not generated through the action of organized political groups, but are instead a product of the bureaucrats' qualifications, peer group pressures, and the ideologies or fads they follow. Because the formulation of policies is not subjected to a broad societal debate through parties or Congress, popular views often go unheard, but not hidden public opinion has spelled the demise of many a social and economic policy in Brazil. In this sense, the implementation of policy-making process is self-defeating. Judiciary. The Brazilian judiciary is composed of a network of state courts with jurisdiction over state matters and a federal court system, not unlike the one in the United States, which maintains jurisdiction over federal crimes. A Supreme Court, the Supreme Federal Tribunal, similar in jurisdiction to the U.S. Supreme Court, but lacking authority over the other branches of government, stands as the final judicial arbiter of court cases. It is composed of 11 justices, each appointed by the president and approved by an absolute majority of the states. The military maintains its own court system. As in the rest of Latin America, the penal codes govern the powers of judges. This makes the judiciary less flexible than its North American counterpart, but it also provides a more effective barrier against judicial activism, the tendency of the courts to render broad interpretations of the law. Since the 1940s, the judicial branch of government in Brazil has been formally entitled to a high degree of independence from the executive power. On many occasions, however, and especially under authoritarian rule, the judiciary was dictated to by the executive branch. More recently, President Collor exercised sweeping executive powers without more judicial review. The Supreme Court was viewed as ceding to the new president significant extra constitutional authority by not challenging Collor's rule by fight. 1 year after the economic mega shock of the asset freeze launched by Collor's, or some of the country's renowned jurists finally decided to oppose further blockage of financial assets on the ground that it was unconstitutional, although opposition came late. It began a national debate concerning the jurisprudence of executive provisional measures, which continues to this day. Recently, the judiciary has been under serious attacks. The main criticism are directed against its lack of political sensitivity to the real problems of the country and to the sweeping corruption infesting the lower levels of the court system. The Supreme Tribunal reluctance to act on these matters leaves little hope for change in the short term. Judicial reform has thus far focused upon speeding up the Supreme Tribunal judicial review functions, avoiding for the moment the trickier question of restructuring the judiciary to eliminate corruption. The future constitutional revision may provide a key step in the much-needed restructuring of the judiciary by subjecting judges to external control through periodic elections, although members of the judiciary deeply resent and fear such a prospect. They argue that such a move would push the institution into the kind of partisanship that has marred policy debates on key social and political issues. However, others consider the structure of the judiciary and its approach to interpreting and implementing laws to be central obstacles in accomplishing policy goals, and yet others argue that court bashing is simply an attempt to reinforce the supremacy of the executive. The judiciary is designed to adjudicate political conflicts as well as civil and social conflicts. The Electoral Supreme Tribunal has exclusive responsibility for the organization, direction, and vigilance of acts related to suffrage. Among the key powers of the TSE are the powers to investigate charges of political partiality by public employees, to file criminal charges against persons violating electoral laws, and to scrutinize and validate electoral results. In addition to these constitutional provisions, under electoral laws and its own regulations, the TSE monitors campaign compliance with the law and executive neutrality in campaigns. The integrity of the tribunal in the conduct of the elections has remained very high, virtually eradicating fraud in national elections. Sub-national government. Brazil has a federal structure with 27 states and the federal district, Brasilia. The state political structures parallel the national government, except that their legislatures are unicameral. States are in turn divided into municipalities, close to 5,000 throughout Brazil. Compared with their counterparts in Latin America, the states and municipalities enjoy much more autonomy from the central government. Although state governments do not retain the leverage over national policy that they enjoyed at the beginning of the century, they still have a great deal of influence. In Mexico, the president has the authority to depose troublesome governors. This, however, is unthinkable in Brazil. Governors, especially from the most populated and industrialized states, acquire broad influence in the capital, Brasilia, due to their vast electorates and dynamic economies. State-based influence pervades the legislature and is a crucial factor in presidential appointments. Usually, powerful state-based figures, political and economic, are given prime appointments in the federal bureaucracy. Throughout the country's political development, Brazilian municipalities have been largely dependent upon states and federal funds. The 1988 Constitution, however, granted them a larger share of financial resources. Since 1946, and even during the military regimes, mayors and city councillors have been directly elected, not appointed by national political authorities as in Venezuela. In contrast to Mexico, where political careers are made in the capital, political careers in Brazil are made at the grassroots level. Moreover, Brazil's mid-sized cities can constitute solid bases for opposition parties, as was the case even during the military period. In contrast, the dominant party in Mexico, the PRI, continuously holds the overwhelmingly majority of municipalities and risks a national political catastrophe if its dominance at the municipal level slips. Study session summary. In this study session, we discussed various historical dilemmas of Brazilian state-making. We noted that the building of state organizations weakened democratic institutions, political representation, and the organization of civil society. We also discussed how the economic development of the country failed to distribute the benefits of industrialization to the majority of its citizenry. Thus, those institutions that regulated citizenship and the larger social and cultural ideas, communicating the concept of the Brazilian nation, incorporated some segments of society while disorganizing and repressing others. We noted that the country's policy making is an embodiment of a state in which political exchanges govern each stage of the policy making process: formulation, decision making, and implementation. End of study session 4. Thank you for listening.